Now.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to episode 4 of the LFC Delaware Podcast. We've got Paul, Sean, Charlie joining us again, Gary, and myself, Timmy. Just coming at you, trying to get our thoughts together again. We've got up to 50 views on our first podcast, so either gaining momentum or just our parents have started to look. I don't know.
Absolutely gaining momentum.
That's it, gaining momentum. Here we go. Only getting better from here. So to break the ice today, we're just going to talk about some of the stuff that's been going on with LFC Delaware. Despite the pandemic, we've still been able to find ways to stay together. What's the hashtag, Paul?
I think it's stay safe. And unity is strength.
Unity is strength. There it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've actually been doing a good job with keeping some unity. We've seen some faces more than others. But Paul, what's some of the stuff that the club's been trying to do to maintain our kind of altruistic slant, even in the midst of being apart?
Cool. So a couple of things. We have donated $1,000 to Food Bank of Delaware, and actually I meant to bring down the letter from them acknowledging that we donated $1,000, which came in yesterday. And we've also, thanks to the raffle for the James Milner shirt, raised just over $1,000, which we're going to give as soon as it comes in to the staff at Rooney's, Catherine Rooney's, who've been clearly really badly impacted by everything that's gone on. We may be looking to do more things, but I think the big two things that we've been trying to do. Other thing I might say is I think we'll probably be doing some more outreach. One of the outreach things will be trying to encourage people to do blood donations, because apparently that's an issue, certainly in Delaware, I am told.
Yeah. Fantastic. So here's a weird icebreaker question. I don't know about weird, but what that makes me think of is some of us have alluded to it as we've been talking about things, but this whole "you'll never walk alone," that is certainly part of our club's ethos. Talking about like supporting the community, supporting our bartenders and servers, even in the middle of, probably one of the worst times in most of their lives. So maybe just a question that we could use to get our juices flowing is, what is "You'll Never Walk Alone"? What has it meant to you? It's like, is that a big part of your supporting the club? Or is it just something that's written on a scarf now and then? What do you think, Charlie?
Well, I mean, I think it's a lot more than something that is sung before the game and, at the conclusion of a winning game, or at halftime of a game that we're being thrashed 3-0 against one of the top clubs in the world, AC Milan. It's just, it was adopted, I understand, many years ago when they played a particular, whichever was the chart-topping song. And then, when something else took over that spot, then the cops started chanting, "Where's our song? Where's our song?" So it was adopted then, and I don't know. I just think it really it strikes a chord with certainly with me, but apparently with most every Liverpool fan across the world. And it's interesting. I was at work one time, and the music's on in the background, and there's a Pink Floyd song. I can't recall the name of the track, but at the end fades in a crowd singing "You'll Never Walk Alone." And I remember, I'm not sure I'd ever heard the song before or ever noticed it, but my ears are piqued by hearing "You'll Never Walk Alone," and I'm walking around like, where is that coming from? Like, is someone singing? Like, what am I listening to here? So I don't know. I think it's just something that I identify with as just being a part of the ethos of the club, and one of the many reasons that I'm as passionate about Liverpool Football Club as I am.
The song is "Fearless" is the song. Great song.
Fearless, yeah, that's
the
right.
medal.
Yeah.
Gary, what?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I don't know, Sean, have you ever been to Anfield?
No.
Yeah. So the other three have been. What's one of your takes on, like, what's that experience like? Because watching it on TV, to steal Charlie's word, sometimes it makes me just want to weep. But I can't imagine to, like, actually be in the middle of that, like, going on before a match is about to begin. Can any of you speak to that?
Spiritual.
Yeah, it seems almost like that. Yeah, it's very.
It's a strange thing. You've got a collective of people who are all there for one thing, and if anything, you'll never walk alone. It's probably, as a fan, as a young fan, when you go with your dad, with your old man, it's the first song that you learn. You know, it's the song. It's the one song that, regardless of whether you've had a good game, a bad game, whether you're playing, you know, Burnley in an FA Cup replay on a Tuesday night and it's -6, or whether you're playing, you know, a European side in the semi-final of the European Cup, that is the unity song. It's almost at the beginning of the game, it's almost sometimes like a call to arms.
Yeah.
You know, to the opposition, it's kind of like, right, give it to them. This is what you're up against. So for me, it's a very, very universal song. It can be a war cry. It can be one of unity. It can be one of celebration. It can be, like Charlie said, a European Cup final half time of, you know, with the fans, let's get behind the team. It's so universal for me, and it's symbolic. It's pretty much sums what the club is in a song for me.
Yeah, I almost wonder, like, if that's not part of the Fortress of Anfield mystique, why we've gone, you know, such a long stretch without, I guess we're to losing a league match at home, but certainly that makes it such an intimidating place to play. Is, you know, you've got U.S. places that talk about, like, Seattle with their 12th fan or 12th man, or however they say it. To have that, like, unified front before the match begins, with just everyone kind of like all together, scarves in the air. I can't imagine what it would be like having to play against that.
I think on LFC TV, there's kind of a little soundbite that plays in between features, and Jordan Henderson sums it up quite well, and he says, "You never get used to it."
Yeah.
And that's a guy that plays for the club, not a visiting player. Right. That's a guy who is our captain, who says, "You never get used to it."
It's true. Yeah, coming from both sides, yeah, intimidating for the opponents, but what that must mean for the guys on the field, for the 11 coming on, that are just like, oh, like, not that we want to drop the ball, so to speak, but
I also do think the magic of it has been recaptured with Jurgen Klopp, because the more you read about Shankly and his socialist background and togetherness and empowering the fans, and the way you look at the way Klopp has galvanised this club over the past 4 or 5 years, I think the synergy is there. And then when you've got, you know, at the end of big games, all the players arm in arm singing the song and they know the words, it kind of brings it home how important the song actually is and what it actually means at our level as a fan and their level as players as well. You've got to get it.
Yeah.
Well, he said that was the first thing he said when he became manager, is turning, you know, supporters from doubters to believers, right?
Yeah.
And then there was one match, I can't remember what it was, but he actually said he felt very alone because I can't remember what match it was. It was in the first year I think he was manager, and
I also think it was.
Yeah,
last game they lost at home.
Yeah, but he was basically pointing the finger at the crowd, saying, you know, we need to turn this around and we need your help. So
I definitely think there have been periods in our history where it's become it's even more significant, and I think, you know, last year you saw it. I think, you know, against Barcelona in the European nights, but it was equally important, and we're going to talk more about this, but I think it was really equally important around the time of Hillsborough, as a kind of a, you know, creating a sense of unity. I guess #unity is strength.
So Paul, you've segued us beautifully. Not such a light topic to speak of today, But as today is April 11th, as we record, we're just 4 days away from the 31st anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, which, speaking of like ethos of the club and formative things for how LFC became what LFC is today, for good or for bad, we can't rule Hillsborough out of that. The city and the club both seems like have been like indelibly kind of just like mixed with that event. So we're just going to talk about it. We're not going to make, hopefully we're not going to make political statements about it, but just talk about, what that is, especially for myself, coming in as, a relatively new guy to the club and the culture. It was one of the first things that I actually got into. And I think I've spoken with a lot of these guys about how important that is, to not just enjoy watching football matches, but if you're going to be a club member, you should know the good and the bad. So we're going to talk about that a bit, see what comes of it. Not to put Gary completely on the spot, but Gary has the distinctive, I don't know what else to call it, as an 11-year-old lad. Gary was at Hillsborough. So we're just going to have him share a little bit of his memory from that day, to kind of set the table for us, and maybe we'll talk about a bit of his memories or whatever from there. So Gary, what do you, as much as you'd like to say, no pressure.
It started out as a very ordinary day. If you look back at the history books, you'll see that the 1989 FA Cup semi-final was a replay of the 1988 FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest. So it was the same kind of day, same route, stopped off at the same pub on the way over the Pennine Way. And kind of everything was ordinary. I remember getting to the ground with my dad. I think there was 5 of us went, and tickets were a premium. We couldn't get tickets together, so I ended up in the main stand, which was the stand opposite the dugouts. I was in the Leppings Lane half. Before the halfway line, my dad was right down near in the main stand, right down near the Leppings Lane, and a friend of ours was somewhere else. So I was sat with another guy who was similar age to myself, and it was a really unremarkable build-up. Where we walked in to go into the main stand, I do very much remember clear as day. It was busy. It was really, really busy, and this is where the build-up of people started to happen, which led to the gate being opened. And I do remember that. I remember a policeman shouting at my dad because his horse stood on him. And my dad kind of went, he didn't use these words, but it was like, watch what you're doing with your horse, mate. And I remember the policeman was overly aggressive, not in line with the kind of carnival atmosphere. I mean, through the eyes of an 11-year-old, there were no rowdy people. There was nobody trying to force the way in. There was no drunkenness or anything like that. It was an ordinary football match at that point. So we went in, and again, clear as day, I remember Peter Beardsley hitting the bar in the first few minutes, and all of a sudden I was aware that there was a policeman came onto the pitch, and you were kind of thinking, this is a little bit strange, this. And the guy who I was with was a little bit older than me. He was 12. We didn't have many adults around us. Nobody knew what was going on. So what you've got to consider is it was before mobile phones. It was before, there was no form of communication, and you were basically sat there watching this tragedy unfold, but nobody knew what was happening. Now, it's only through reading reports, my own maturity of reading around things, that you actually realise the one thing, again, sticks in my mind clear as day, is there was a line of police officers stood on the halfway line, seemingly idle. And what transpired is it was being treated as crowd disturbance.
Yeah.
It wasn't being treated as a disaster at this point. Basically, it wasn't being managed. People didn't understand what was going on, and the day we were just left to sit it out. It went from talk of, do you think it will be? Do you think they'll put the kickoff back, they'll restart the game? To the point of, this doesn't look good. At which point, my dad found us. He came up, he walked up through the stand, he came and found us, and we're all together. And I remember only one ambulance made it onto the pitch. I clearly remember bodies. Clearly remember bodies on advertising hoardings. You knew, even as an 11-year-old, you knew something wasn't right. They eventually let us out to the ground. When we got out of the ground, there was row upon row upon row of ambulances, which at the time, again, through 11-year-old eyes, I didn't think too much of it. Many, many years later, you think to yourself, why the hell weren't they allowed into the ground to help people? What were they doing out there? What stopped this?
Right.
We came back. We started walking back towards the car, and there was a lot of local residents allowing fans to use the telephone again in the days before mobile phones. And I remember we called my mum and let her know that we were fine. One scary thing about this is, in the days leading up, as I've previously said, tickets were like gold dust. And my dad actually had a ticket for Leppings Lane End, and he didn't want to stand up. So my mum actually went back to Anfield to the ticket office when it was just behind the Shankly gates and swapped the ticket. And she managed to get a ticket, so you think to yourself,
Oh my goodness.
what could have happened there? Did the person that took that ticket, was he one of the 95 as it was then? Because the 96th person didn't die until sometime later. All these things go through your mind. It only really hit me as a youngster, probably on the Monday morning when I went back to school. My headmaster was waiting for me at the school gate because he knew I was there. And he gave me a massive hug, and I was like, you don't get hugs off your headmaster, do you? He was a Man City fan. He was a season ticket holder. And we used to always talk about football. And it was kind of, the aftermath of it, of what the Sun printed, which I'm sure you're all well aware of and have researched. That kind of set the tone for the investigation. It set the tone for false truth, despite the fact that the Taylor report had quite clearly and squarely laid the blame at police management. And it took an awful long time to shake the truth off. And the biggest tragedy for me is we are now probably 30 years down the line. We're probably almost 2 generations into people who don't know and don't understand. And you see now, even today, I've seen somebody on Twitter today has posted a picture of the dead with a picture of Boris Johnson's face on a Chelsea player's face holding a Champions League trophy. And Liverpool fans on Twitter have gone after him and completely ruined him. And unfortunately, you've got a breed of fans now that think it's good banter to have a bit of a giggle about it. And that, to me, is perhaps just as big a tragedy as the 96, really.
Yeah. I think one thing that thank you, first of all, sorry.
No worries.
One thing that I have found interesting in watching documentaries and reading about this is there's certainly, like, even coming into, like, before this event happened, there was still a bit of bias towards Liverpool because obviously, what was it, 4 years prior was Heysel,
1985, yeah, absolutely.
So I think a lot of people at that time, like you speak of, people thinking it was a crowd disturbance and the police lining up midfield, that perhaps that's what they were thinking, like, oh, here are those Liverpool fans, carrying on again. So in some ways, we came into Hillsborough already with a little bit of a tick on our name. But then certainly afterwards, there's this other part about it where, as you said, like other supporters of other clubs feel that that's like fair game to say, oh, well, you guys are the ones that did this.
The thing is, it wasn't at the time, and I think I said this in the last podcast, or it might have been in the chat that we had in the build up to it. I went to the FA Cup semi-final replay at Old Trafford that year, and also then went on to Wembley to watch the final. Ironically, it was against Everton, and Tony Cottee was offside for that goal, by the way, Paul.
Didn't he remember Tony Cottee scored?
No, he didn't. Stuart McCall scored the equaliser, and Tony Cottee was stood on the goal line. He was offside.
Oh, right. I do remember that.
Anyway, and I distinctly remember, the whole fan base and the Everton fans chanting for Merseyside in unison.
Yeah.
You wouldn't get that now.
No.
You really wouldn't get that now. The rivalry has gone intensely bitter. And I think that's a very, very sad thing. But then the landscape's changed. Football's changed. You can jump on Twitter and say what you want with seeming impunity. So unfortunately, that's just one of those things.
Few things I would say, actually, just building on what you had talked about, is I was on a call last year with one of the Supporters Club calls with Tony Barrett. I don't know if you know who Tony Barrett is. Yeah. He used to write for the Times, I think.
He's fan liaison now, Tony, isn't he?
He works for the club now. Yeah. So people were saying, they were talking about what can we boycott. They were talking about, in terms of who's got an association with the Sun newspaper that we can boycott. And he was saying, well, I understand, why you would want to do that, but he thinks that education is the only thing that's going to help now. So
I'd agree with that.
Getting into schools and talking about what happened, and all the things that sort of have played out in this 31 years, which meant that for a long time, truth wasn't even in the public domain, and certainly justice, as we've talked about, has been half served. I think.
Oh, what do you remember about that day in the aftermath? Curious.
Do you want to go first, Gary? Because I have a few things I could share.
God, it was horrible. It was somber. I remember going to Anfield and laying flowers on the Kop. It's the best way of describing it. Football was the last thing on anybody's minds. The whole city was the city was numb. It was disbelief. And, I hate to go back to the politicised side of it, but when the Sun started writing reports of what they did, this disaster happened in front of thousands of witnesses. It happened in front of TV cameras, and categorically, this stuff that was being printed didn't happen. So there was already a sense of injustice brewing as well. There was anger.
I don't know if you've seen the images, but they're in. So we should probably mention the ESPN 30 for 30 video, which is available if you have ESPN Plus, and if you don't and you want to reach out to us, I'm sure we could find a way to get you access. But they show an image on there of the whole of the pitch at Anfield, full of flowers and scarves, and I remember going there, and it was just incredibly moving. The sense of there's just this outpouring of grief and about people going to a football match and not coming home. And the one distinct memory I have is like the week after we were was in the city centre, and at 3:06, which is when the game was stopped the week before. So this would be the 22nd of April. The whole city stopped for a minute. It was like absolute silence in this bustling, shopping area in the center of town, just to pay your respects. Just lot of I know I'm kind of losing the words and I'm probably about to cry, but it was a very hard time to live through. But there was something. The identity of the city was really strong, I think, through clearly over 31 years. There've been certain people who've done some kind of incredible stuff just to keep the getting to the truth. But even in that kind of moment, weeks and afterwards, felt like there was something very powerful going on in the city.
One thing I'm curious about is how did the club change? How did it change the club? And really what I'm thinking is that I didn't, I was whatever, I guess I was 8 years old at the time. And I didn't become a fan until I was, close to 30. But what was the club like before Hillsborough? Because I think my experience and most supporters' experience, I guess, especially in America, is only, relatively recently. And it's, sometimes I wonder how did it change? What was the club like before and then after?
I think from a physical perspective, the club were the first to chop down the fences. So the crowd retention fences, they come down more or less straight away. And they were probably the first club to have kind of a bit of a breathing space. So they made like a bulkhead in front of, in front of where the fences would be. In terms of how it changed, I guess it become more open. Players attended. The club made sure that players were able to attend funerals, were there to speak to families, which must have been incredibly hard. I think John Aldridge has gone on the record as saying that he found it incredibly hard and nearly walked away from the game because, this is one thing that we forget even now. We look at our favourite players and we look at them and give them this godlike status, but they are just ordinary people. Yeah. I've been lucky to meet a number of players on the same flight as Daniel Agger, Pepe Reina, Fernando Torres, and Xabi Alonso in Copenhagen when they played an overnight game and an international rather, and having a chat with them. And I remember going up to Fernando Torres. I've got the signatures in a Brian Reed book actually. And I remember going over to him excited, and you expect these people to be 10 feet tall and full of confidence. And he wasn't. He was a kid. And he was more scared of me than I was of him. And the club, the club and the players put themselves in this position to almost counsel people. I believe Kenny Dalglish and his wife attended every single funeral. Mm. So, from that perspective, it was an open door policy at the club. It was kind of like, whatever you need, you say the word and we're here for you.
Is there almost a sense that Hillsborough maybe even solidified the You'll Never Walk Alone, the family aspect of the club a bit because of was there that feel beforehand? Obviously, everyone loved the song for many years before then. But it feels like almost like, as you're saying, like the players were more accessible and the club in general was a bit more family-like, it sounds like.
It was something we probably clung to. It was something that we used for hope.
Yeah. It's frankly hard to think what it was like before.
Yeah.
In my mind. I'd seen a lot of football. I was a season ticket holder at that time. It's hard. You kind of, a lot of your memory is now influenced by all the videos that you see. So you kind of remember the teams, but it's hard to remember what the relationship with the club was like before then. I'm sure it wasn't as close as it became.
Well, from a personal perspective, and I think I've mentioned this before, myself and my father have spoken about this once in 31 years.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a very long conversation, and I've always found it very, very difficult to talk about. And we kind of stopped going in midway through 91, and we went home and away. We went everywhere. I mean, at that time, we didn't go away into Europe because we were banned, but, you know, I've been to virtually every single Division 1 ground as it was. And I've never had the balls to ask him this question. I probably never will, but I firmly believe he fell out of love with the game. And I think that he must have come under pressure from my mum, because I was 11 years old, and I went to that game, as many of us did, you know, as a young kid, and things were never the same ever again.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And I can't describe what changed. I can't give you the before and after. All I can say to you is it was different.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think says enough, to be honest with you. So something
one thing to mention I was going to is that if you want to kind of know more about it, there's obviously the video, but the Phil Scraton book here, Hillsborough, The Truth, it is an awesome read. This guy was responsible for uncovering a lot of the stuff that subsequently kind of brought the truth to light. Highly recommended if you want to kind of know more about the subject. And also, I think you were referencing Brian Reed's Two Tribes.
Yeah.
Gary, yeah, that's another book which is kind of interesting from a sociological perspective about Liverpool in the 80s, as well as and some of the things that led up to, I think you alluded to it before, Tim, about Liverpool perhaps not being viewed in the best light, and generally football supporters being regarded as hooligans first and people second.
I think the thing is as well, I can't remember the name of the book, and I don't know whether I've got it here, but I'm actually reading at the moment, and it's about the city in the 80s, and you know, if you go back even further to you know, without wanting to get too political, of the managed decline that was quoted by the then Conservative government, and Liverpool had effectively been, or the plan was to leave it to its own devices. It had, you know, the docks, the dock industry had collapsed, had high unemployment, as a result, high crime, etc. And the 80s were not really a good time for the area. It wasn't very prosperous, but we had two of the best football clubs in the world. And the government of the time hated football. They really couldn't care less for it. So, unfortunately, you were on the back foot to begin with.
Yeah.
Well,
how are we doing for time, Tim?
We're running long as usual.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I would say in closing, one thing that we wanted, we've mentioned already is how do we keep people aware of what happened, maybe without staying in the past. And one of the things we wanted to touch on is this symbolism or remembrance that we wear on our shirts for every match, and just how that's kind of developed over the years.
Charlie's pointing out his flame.
He's getting ahead of himself there, because that's not the original.
I think for me, when it comes to education, I almost think that probably current new members almost need to be directed to contrast.org and read it and watch it and understand it, because it is an indelible part of the club. Mm-hmm. And the history. You know, I try not to let it define me. I try not to let it define my support of the club, because it's all about the here and now. But I think, as Paul said before, it's about education. It's about hearts and minds. Because, I mean, ironically enough, I bought my nephew a few years ago that book on Hillsborough. Never read it myself.
Yeah.
I've struggled with the thought of reading it, but maybe I need to make an Amazon purchase.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard read. It is. But it's heroic though, aspects of the story, some of the characters.
I guess my problem is my underlying emotion is still one of anger.
Yep.
Because of injustice.
Yeah. So I read it before the most recent developments in the criminal trial. So maybe that made it easier to read at that point, in the belief that it was finally resolved, and it clearly isn't finally resolved.
Yeah, I think the pivotal thing for me was probably when the government sent Andy Burnham up to the remembrance service. And I don't know whether you guys have ever seen the video footage of it, but it started out with one chant or one cry of justice for the 96.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's in 30 for 30.
That's in the documentary. Yeah, they highlight that as a turning point.
It was very much so, and credit to Andy Burnham, considering he's a blue nose. He went away and run with it, and he didn't let it go. And that to me was modern day pivotal, because when it went back to court and it was found that Duckenfield had done wrong. Ironically, and I don't know why I was there. I was outside St George's Hall in Liverpool, and there was a big TV screen, and I was like, "It's powerful stuff."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you were getting to, Tim, the kind of notion of kind of where is it memorialized? And obviously, if you've got one of the brand new shirts, which most people have, it's memorialized on the back with the Hillsborough Flames and the 96. And I think Charlie was showing the previous edition, which is still in use, with the green and the red flames, which actually is in our official Supporters Club logo. But and that came into being, I think, in 1999. Prior to that, in 1993, the shirt looks something like this. If you can see that, which I think they started wearing this in '93 as a memory.
Yeah, it was centenary, wasn't it? It was 100 years, I think.
I think it was the season. Yeah, the season after. Season after 100 years, 93 would have been a season after. Yeah. I believe there was some controversy about changing to the 96 on the back because the families weren't necessarily consulted in that change. But I think overall, it's fitting.
On a personal note, I've always preferred the simple logo that we have now, because that to me reminds me of when I first started watching the game, and my first kit in kind of 83, 84. So me, it's and it harks back to the memories that my dad told me about of watching Liverpool in the 60s and the 70s, of the traditional logo. In terms of it being on the back, I like it. I think it gives it more of its own place. I think it's the logo for me got too busy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually see a couple of those. So Charlie's wearing the more modern, which
this is the 125th anniversary version, but
yeah,
it's nice. Whereas I think Sean's wearing the Daniel Agger shirt with the older version, where the flames are in the crest.
Which is interesting with the kit switch to Nike. Sorry.
Nike.
A lot of people have been talking about if they wanted to add the teal to the trim. A lot of people are saying that they should switch back to that logo with the gate over the top to bring that color back in. But I think I'm with Gary on that one, that the kind of classic old logo is
less is more.
A bit nicer. And I actually, in my short run as a Red, I've had more people ask me about the 96 with the Flames, family members and things like that. What exactly does that mean? And that was actually how I had to learn about Hillsborough, because I said, well, I have no idea. Something happened in 1996, I guess. And that's when I looked up, and that's when I started reading books and watching documentaries. So even if that is the catalyst to get people to learn something, I think it's worth having it on the shirt just for that.
That's why I like it on the back, 'cause it's more poignant. On the front, unless you've kind of been to Anfield and you've seen the Eternal Flame and you make the connection with the Eternal Flame and the flat and the badge, you'd never really know.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, a badge with some stuff on it.
Yeah.
You know, whereas with it being on the back, it makes proper reference to the 96. I personally think it's fantastic. I really like it.
Well, boys, it's been about 40 minutes.
Okay.
We've done well.
Gary, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Gary.
I think we could talk about this probably until we're allowed to go back into the world, and then maybe still for a few years afterwards. So maybe we'll circle around and pick up on some of this again at some point. But certainly coming up, 31st anniversary in 4 days' time. If you've not read anything about it, as Paul suggested, this is an excellent book to read about it. If you want the cliff notes of this, there's actually probably about a 10-year-old interview available on YouTube if you just search for Phil Scratton, Hillsborough, just with Phil himself, talking about some of the key points in the investigation in the book. The 30 for 30 is excellent. There's a BBC version of that was excellent as well.
And Gary, what was the link that you mentioned?
Contrast.org. I'll send it to everybody in chat again, so we've all got it. And I'm just actually ordering the book.
Wow.
I figured it's time, so no time like the present. There you go.
So I should say, actually, this is my daughter's copy. She went to Anfield and was interested in reading it.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Joey Megginson, if you're looking at this, you have my copy. Have you passed it to anybody else yet?
All right. Well, boys, thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to Gary and also to Paul for sharing. That's it's tough stuff, but it's part of the club. It's part of who we are. I'll throw myself in with you all now. But yeah, I guess we'll be back next week. Rats, Paul, do you have the fellow's name who is going to join us next week?
Yeah, James Martin, who's a freelance journalist from Liverpool, who's written a piece about supporters clubs in the US, is going to join us, and we'll have a nice chat with him.
Yeah. Here's looking forward to that. All right, guys. Have a good weekend. You'll never walk alone. Stay home, stay safe. Unity is strength.
Yep.
All those things.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Take care. Thanks, mate.